Good evening, my name is Neal Long. I work at the Spencer Museum of Art as the tours coordinator and am also a doctoral candidate in voice in the School of Music. It was my honor and a great joy to serve as director for the two operas we will be discussing tonight. The two operas, Snow Angel and As One, were presented at the Lead Center this last Tuesday by students in the voice, opera, and orchestra programs. Tonight's community conversation provides an opportunity to further explore themes in the operas as they relate to ideas in the Spencer Museum's exhibition, Healing, Knowing, Seeing the Body. If you haven't already done so, I invite you to explore the exhibition in person or virtually on our website. This exhibition features more than 150 works of art that demonstrate how understandings of the body and its many complexities have changed through time, been mediated through different cultural contexts, and ultimately connect us to one another through time and across space. I would like to, at this time, briefly introduce you to our panelists. Lily DeSett is an author and activist from the Kansas City area and directed As One. Dr. Bonnie McLarty is a composer and collaborative pianist. She composed Snow Angel for her dissertation project at KU. Dylan Mortimer is a Kansas City-based artist and creative. His work is featured in Healing, Knowing, Seeing the Body. Kyle Velte is an associate professor of law at the KU School of Law, where she teaches evidence and torts, and her scholarship and teaching examines the intersection of sexuality, gender, and the law. Dr. Carolyn Watson is the director of orchestra activities at the KU School of Music and conducted both Snow Angel and As One. Welcome. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to set expectations for tonight's event and run through a few housekeeping items. The first 50 minutes or so will consist of a conversation amongst our panelists with clips from the operas totaling about 10 minutes interspersed. In the last 20 minutes or so, we will take comments and questions from those in attendance. A few other things to note. We are recording this session and may make it available to the public as a resource in the future. We enjoy seeing you on screen, but if you prefer anonymity or to be off screen, you can rename your profile and or turn your camera off. Turning your camera off can also help if you have an unstable internet connection. Please keep your mic on mute except when asking a question or stating a comment. My colleagues, Adina and Casey, will be monitoring the chat throughout. Please post questions or comments there at any time during this event. In the last 20 minutes or so, you are welcome to unmute and ask questions directly. If we experience unforeseen technical difficulties, please bear with us and we'll do our best to correct them promptly. If you need technical assistance during the program, please reach out to Adina using the chat or the number she provides in the chat. And lastly, Snow Angel and As One contain mature content, and the themes discussed tonight may lead to audience members feeling emotionally activated. We encourage you to reach out if you need support. Currently enrolled KU students may connect during this session, in a private breakout room with Jill Flessing from KU Counseling and Psychological Services. To connect with Jill, please send a direct message in the chat to Adina. Community members are encouraged to reach out to Headquarters Counseling Services using the information in the chat, which I will post right now. And it's already there, brilliant. Thank you, Adina. The presentation of Snow Angel and As One, including this event, is made possible by the following partners: the KU School of Music, KU Counseling and Psychological Services, the Lead Center, and the Spencer Museum of Art. On behalf of all involved, thank you for making this possible. And without further ado, let's get to it. I am going to stop sharing my screen here for a moment, and we'll learn more about our panelists by asking the question, how do you see your experience represented in these operas? Anybody's free to start.
Oh, fine, I'll bite the bullet. Okay. So as a one, as the director for As One, but as a trans woman, I felt that it was very refreshing, I think, to see a trans experience portrayed in opera. And I felt like it kind of gave me a sense of hope. I heard about this opera when it premiered in 2010, and I was living a very dishonest time in my life. I was not being honest to myself about who I was, and I felt like that opera gave me a lot of hope. So to be able to be involved in this production of it just made me ecstatic. But I think that As One definitely, was a step in the right direction for representation, for trans representation, not just in media, but even in like the higher arts like opera. And then as a sexual assault survivor, I thought that Snow Angel especially was a very powerful representation of what that type of experience is like and how to grow from it. So that was my experiences with those two operas.
Lily, thank you so much for your answer. And I'd also like to ask you about your familial connection to this specific production of As One.
Yes. So my brother, Jacob DeSett, played the role as Hannah in the Tuesday night production of As One. And it was very fun. It bossed him around a little bit. I missed that.
We are so thankful that you were both involved. It was truly a joy working with you both. Who else?
Likewise.
Well, since you mentioned Snow Angel, I suppose for me, discovering Wyatt's poetry and the stories that were interlaced in the larger book of poetry, which I actually drew poems from, which is called Rewriting the Body. By the way, you should all check it out. It's unbelievably amazing. But when I read through this, the thing that struck me was that in this larger work of poetry, there are a number of threads moving through, and the experience of trauma, regardless of what kind of trauma, for me, it's really spoke to the fact that when you experience something traumatic, there's not just a linear and you're better, but you have all these different, sometimes conflicting or uneven responses to it. And I felt that the poetry it really spoke to that. And for me, I think one of my favorites is actually Behind the Shirt, because it's a woman speaking about her body. Specifically, I mean, it's not boobs as a sex object or boobs as, nourishment for a child, but it's a woman's experience of her own body and owning all the things that breasts are. And it's her speaking about it. And so I felt that poem, I felt really heard, I guess, with that poem. And so even though, of course, in a sense, they're not my words, I felt like I was able to say something with those. And so I guess that's where I feel reflected in the music, is the nonlinear depiction of trauma and a woman's voice talking about a woman's body.
I can jump in. And I'll bring a decidedly kind of analytical and legal lens to the conversation tonight, which I hope is okay. I thoroughly enjoyed it just as a spectator and someone who enjoys music, but I did want to share some of my perspectives from as a lawyer. And Snow Angel, when I was in law school, I was in a live client clinic. So as a student, I was able to represent clients, and it was in Washington, D.C. in domestic violence court, where there are all manner and sorts of sexual assaults by intimate partners, and really seeing the limits of the law, right? Like protective orders are pieces of paper, and guns don't care about paper. And if you listen to the speech last night by President Biden about intimate partners and the boyfriend exception to gun bans and those kinds of things, that all came up for me, kind of watching the trauma unfold on the stage with the two singers. And the trauma of the clients is not the only trauma we see in domestic violence courts. Often judges are on a docket for domestic violence for a year or two at a time. Those are the only cases they hear. And there's secondary trauma, both for judges who hear the cases, for the lawyers who represent the clients. And, as a younger law student, I was thinking, feeling helpless and despair and frustrated about like the structures behind the violence, right? About toxic masculinity and misogyny and poverty and how those all interrelate. I just saw a lot of those themes kind of come out, in the law, as well as that were brought up in the opera on Tuesday. And then for As One, I was tremendously moved by that one. I've spent the bulk of my time in the legal academy looking at kind of contemporary legal debates about and current normative questions about LGBTQ rights issues, and focus on law and social change and how those things interact, and really the relationship of social movements, the Constitution, religion, the state's responsibility, right, to promote equality, and the societal tensions between equal citizenship and in a democratic society. And you see all of that, I think, all those themes come up in the opera. And in that way, it really directly connected to my work as a legal scholar and advocate, which I'll talk more a little bit about in a little bit. So I'll stop for now.
I guess I can jump in. Now, thank you so much, Lily and Kyle and Bonnie for sharing all those things, and obviously Wyatt for your amazing words. For me, these are both very powerful stories, and that's really why I wanted to tell them. And in terms of my own personal experience, I guess we always try to fit in our environments wherever they are, and often we have to, I think, kind of maybe hide part of ourselves, or at least keep certain parts of ourselves to ourselves and not share that so widely. And certainly as a non-native American, and an immigrant to this country, I've sort of navigated that, and it's been for me more challenging in certain environments than others. And while it's directly not necessarily related to the two stories and events that these two operas chronicle, I think both of them I really identify with the search for acceptance and the search for just that moving on, like how you process the different parts. And as I really appreciated what Bonnie was saying, and that is reflected in Wyatt's words as well, the lack of something linear, and you'll have a great day and you think, yeah, okay, this is it. I love my adopted country. Everything's great. And then you go to the grocery store and, you get abused because someone hears your accent. And crazy as it seems, I mean, that has actually happened to me on more than one occasion. I guess just that sort of perspective really spoke to me, and the whole kind of, trying to process that within myself, and also trying to, I guess, find an environment that I'm comfortable in. I haven't tried Norway yet, but maybe that's next on the list.
I'll just jump in also and just note my perception in relation to the pieces and the visual art exhibition as well, through the lens of organ transplant, and receiving a gift beyond myself to live and breathe in lung transplant, and the paradox of both trauma and joy of that. For me personally, for my donor, my donor's family, for my family, the tension of both existing simultaneously, euphoria and breath and life like never before, and simultaneously anxiety and guilt, and the heaviness of contending with another life, breathing through my body now, and the mixed emotions of that, the complexity of that, definitely resonated with both pieces in that tension, for sure.
Thank you all for sharing those thoughts. I'd like to take this opportunity to show you all a piece of Dylan's that is featured in Healing, Knowing, and Seeing the Body. And Dylan, perhaps invite you to tell us a bit about this piece and how the trauma that you've experienced as a result of your condition has shaped the way in which you create.
Sure. Thanks, Neal, and everyone for having me. I began making work in relation to my health about 7 years ago, as I was born with a respiratory disease, but did not really directly involve that in the things I was creating till that time where my health was declining to the point that I was being evaluated for lung transplant. And so I began to incorporate images of bronchial trees and cells and scars, and kind of imagining healing, imagining healthy cells, rendering sick cells as well. But everything began, and still to this day, is kind of layered in this collage process of thick paint and glitter. I saw these shiny materials and mediums as a way of kind of contending with the trauma and sort of hopelessness of all of it, the hopelessness that I was sort of diagnosed with, and the way my condition was reported by doctors, and be it before my first lung transplant or after I also received a second lung transplant, and just lots of times of darkness and not a lot of hope being given to me or seen or able to be searched for. Yet simultaneously, the kind of joy and euphoria again of receiving this gift of life twice over now. And so this piece in particular is kind of a rendition of the surgery, but it's also, I'm there like laying on the table with bronchial branches over me. And again, this is all cut paper kind of collage and layered and painted on, sort of a multi-layer collage. The scale's about 4 foot by 8 foot. So it's a surgical scene where people are kind of operating and sort of working on me, but also kind of contending, praying, asking, all around me. And the overall mood is kind of one of like a party, like it's sort of like a dance party happening, surgical scene kind of all in conjunction and in a space like atmosphere. So it's this collision. Again, I sort of use the word paradox a lot of, because it's kind of both and, not either or. There's sadness and joy happening. There's hope and hopelessness happening simultaneously. So the cellular activity is kind of placed as halos around these doctors as well. So it's again, it's sort of both and. There's something physical and metaphysical happening. There's concern and there's hope, both are sort of colliding in the space of life, so to speak. So the title is Like the Ceiling Can't Hold Us. It's kind of also a rendition of this biblical story of someone being lowered down through the roof for healing because it's too crowded, like in this parable where Jesus is in a house and it's just too crowded to get to him. His friends take the roof apart and lower him down. So it's, I see it kind of as a party, like the song "Ceiling Can't Hold Us." That it's a party that sort of literally throws the roof off, and yet it's trauma and processing of trauma all at once.
Dylan, thank you so much. You mentioned joy and sadness and hope and hopelessness, these opposing ideas. And the word joy comes up in As One. And so I'd like to take this opportunity to share a clip from As One. This is To Know, which closes part 1 of As One. And while I'm pulling up the clip, I would love to invite Lily to briefly contextualize this piece for us in the opera.
Thank you, Neal. So with this piece, so this song, To Know, is that moment when Hannah, after a period of squashing the truer, authentic part of herself down, she sees a trans woman on TV, and then she hears the word. So she hears the word, and in this case, I'm going to say transgender. She hears the magic word, and there's a sort of power in learning. She doesn't necessarily go like, oh, that's, even though she doesn't say in the songs like, oh, that is me, that is my word. It sometimes takes like a moment to click. So she's having this moment of realization, like, it's me. That's me. That's what I am. And there's just such a freedom and a kind of like a healing, a removal of a burden, just being able to know. It's like she still had to hide, or she felt that she had to hide this aspect of herself from the people around her, but she knows. And I think that was what was very important about that song, was the power of her knowing for herself.
Wonderful, thank you. One of the things that is very typical in the opera world is to assign cover assignments. And some of you may know a term that's perhaps a bit more familiar, which is understudy. And so with our productions, we did in fact have understudies. So you'll hear To Know sung by our wonderful cover singers, Grace Heldridge, mezzo-soprano, and Christian Laredo, baritone. I will note that the sound is a bit soft on this video, so you may want to turn the volume up if necessary. One of the great things about As One, in my opinion, is the use of humor throughout, which very nicely contrasts the serious content. So this word power comes up, and I'd like to take this opportunity and talk about the power that we have to support the transgender community. And Kyle, I'd like to ask you, what is your response to anti-trans issues and legislation we see in the news? What can the KU community do to address these issues?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I'm going to take just a really brief moment to talk briefly about the bills. So we're all kind of grounded in the same starting point, which is in Kansas and in 30 other states, and probably more to follow quickly. There's a set of bills being put through. One would criminalize doctors who provide gender affirming care to transgender youth. And others, they're called Fairness to Women and Girls in Sports bills, which is very deceptive, which I'll talk about in a minute, would ban transgender girls from playing on girls' sports teams, K through 12 and at the college level. And this is really just the latest chapter in a coordinated campaign to really push back against the gains of the LGBT community, really since marriage equality in 2015. And we've seen a wave of bathroom bills 4 years ago, and that lost a lot of political momentum when the business community said, no, we're going to boycott you economically. The NCAA started to pull out tournaments for North Carolina, for example, who had the most notorious bathroom bill that was passed. And these new bills, and Kansas passed one of them so far, which was the anti-transgender sports bill, which the governor did veto, but now there's a risk of the veto being overridden by the legislature. So one concrete thing you can do is call your representative in the Kansas State Legislature and tell them, do not override the veto of the bill. These bills really seek, I think, to erase transgender people and youth in particular from public life in the most important ways, and really prey on the most vulnerable in our communities, which are transgender youth. They are proposing a solution for a problem that does not exist. There's no inherent advantage that transgender girls have when they play against cisgender girls. There's a lot of myth around that and stereotype that is just incorrect as a matter of fact. And so something I think it's important to point out about this bill, the sports bill in particular, is that cisgender girls should also be concerned, because if anyone suspects you of being transgender under these bills, they will be able to demand that you undergo an invasive, essentially genital inspection. And so if you're a parent of a 12-year-old cisgender girl who's a tomboy, who has short hair, who might dress in quote unquote traditional boys' clothes, these bills are really about policing what femininity means for both cisgender girls and transgender girls. And so when I say it's kind of a misnomer to say it's about fairness to girls and women in sports, it's really about policing all girls, transgender and cisgender girls alike. And so the harm around the physician bill should be clear, right? If folks don't get gender affirming care, the risk of suicide and attempted suicide is massively disproportionate for transgender youth. It's like 40% of transgender youth have thought about or tried to commit suicide. And so these are really harmful bills, again, for problems that do not exist. And so the physician bill is still hasn't been voted on yet by the full legislature. That is still sitting there. So you could call and encourage your representative to not not vote for that when it does come up for a full vote. But we are seeing this across the country in a wave of kind of, I think, well, I can answer more questions in the Q&A about where I think this is coming from and why. But certainly what we saw in As One in terms of the violence against trans women, it is still real. And this, I would frame this as state violence, right? It's state violence against trans people. The opera talked about individuals, right, threatening or attacking trans people, and that certainly happens all the time. But when the state gets involved and passes legislation that is directly going to harm transgender people, I would argue that the state itself is a perpetrator of violence in ways that connect to the themes of the operas as well.
And if I might add on to that too, Kyle, there's still a majority of the states that have the trans panic defense law, which, for those of you who are not aware, it allows anyone, generally this is used by cis men who murder trans women, to basically get away with murder of trans individuals. So I definitely agree, Kyle, that there is a lot of state and legal violence against trans people. Even today, you know, even though we've made so many strides, we have such a long way to go.
And one thing, if you don't mind me adding on, is that this really connected to me to some of the things that Dylan was saying about his work. And I went to the exhibit today, and I think it connects with some of those, which is, you know, there's a lot of medical gatekeeping as well as legal gatekeeping around what it means to be transgender. And so for many trans folks, if they want to medically transition, they have to go to a doctor for a certain amount of time. They have to get a certain amount of letters. They have to say a certain thing. And so therefore doctors hold the key to transition for the folks who want, for example, to have gender confirmation surgery or to get hormones. And then the medical gatekeeping works hand in hand with the law, which says you have to, some states say you have to have surgery, like the full-on complete transition surgically, in order to change the gender marker on your driver's license, for example. And so the medical gatekeeping and the legal gatekeeping around transgender personhood and public life are connected in really important and troubling ways.
Thank you both. Dr. Watson, Snow Angel and As One were programmed partly in response to the pandemic, but also as an opportunity, as we're doing now, to teach students and to teach people about important social issues. Can you talk a bit about the intentions of presenting these works and perhaps what you hope both students and audience members took away from this experience?
Sure. Thank you, Neal, for the question. I mean, the motivation behind programming these works was really manifold. I mean, I was looking to try to provide some kind of operatic experience for students, easier said than done in a pandemic, obviously. And when our planned main stage opera production was cancelled, I think back in October or November, it was quite clear that it wasn't going to happen in the spring. I got to thinking, you know, wouldn't it be great to have a kind of orchestral experience? Wouldn't it be great to orchestral operatic experience? Wouldn't it be great to try to find a way to make something happen? And we had this time set aside, and I got thinking about what that could possibly be. And it's like, okay, so grand opera can't happen, so maybe we could do something on a smaller scale. And typically at KU and schools in general, chamber operas don't tend to be performed that often. And it just seemed like a very good opportunity to explore some different repertoire and a different kind of project. So that was sort of, I guess, my starting point. I had known of As One, and I had also known a little bit about Snow Angel because Neal had actually sent it to me in the summer, and I sat down with those two works, and I kind of had the idea that it would be good to, you know, try to send a very, very powerful message, because at the time I was having these thoughts was obviously as a result of, you know, last summer and everything that happened with regard to the racial violence and the reckoning and the work that still needs to be done there. And also, I mean, obviously as a woman and certainly as a female conductor, I experience, and I have experienced quite a lot of gender bias, discrimination, humiliation, misogyny, and that for me is obviously a very personal kind of matter. And the power that Wyatt and Bonnie told that story of a woman who really has just endured the most traumatic experience that I think any woman can go through, and the I don't want to say the progress, but really just the power with which she embraced moving on, really spoke to me. And I think when we look at our college campuses, I believe the statistic is that 25% of undergraduate females will, in their time at college, endure some kind of sexual assault. And that for me is just unbelievably shocking. And as we know, a lot of rape, a lot of sexual assault, a lot of sexual harassment, the vast majority, in fact, it just does not get reported because it is so difficult to prove, to deal with, to show it actually happened. And I felt that, you know, putting these two works together, two works by female composers, telling a very powerful story, very relevant stories, actually. I think we have this idea of opera perhaps as being, you know, 19th century people in ball gowns taking 3 hours to die. And while there is a little bit of that, or maybe arguably quite a lot of that, these kinds of stories I hoped would allow us, the KU School of Music, the opera program, and the students involved to really reach out and kind of say to their broader circle of friends and colleagues, hey, this is what opera is. Opera can look like those 19th century women, but it can also look like this. It can be, you know, a transgender teenager. It can be a woman who's undergoing trauma and moving on. So that was a big part of my thinking as well, really wanting to break down stereotypes with regard to what opera is, the kinds of things, quote unquote, we should be doing and learning in school. And just at the, you know, at the heart of it, these are two phenomenal works of art. It must be said, I programmed them for their musical value. I programmed them for their dramatic value. And I programmed them because it would give both the musicians and the students involved an opportunity to shine.
Thank you, Dr. Watson. I'd like to invite our participants at this point to begin considering questions to pose to our panelists. We'll start to address those in about 10 minutes. I do want to take this opportunity to share with you all an excerpt from Snow Angel. This is In Extremis, and it falls in the second half of Snow Angel, which unfortunately on Tuesday, some of you may not have heard because of a technical glitch, which does happen. The lead center is fantastic and has offered us an opportunity to retake our production of Snow Angel so that we can get a solid recording. So that will take place Saturday. But I'll show you In Extremis here. And Bonnie, before we begin, I would love for you to contextualize this a bit and also perhaps talk about your decision to set a singular character or a singular poetic voice with two singers.
Sure. So I'll go for the second part of that first, actually. So in terms of this set of, you know, kind of this chamber opera that's functionally a set of 10 songs of, you know, with some sung by one singer, some sung by the other, and quite a few done in some sort of dialogue or duet. I think many of us have a lot of, you know, the voices in our heads that talk to ourselves. And I think for me, it was a lot more interesting and maybe real to have two singers, like the different parts of oneself talking rather than having a single monologue. I also, well, I did it for maybe the selfish reason of the fact that when I'm in an ensemble, I really enjoy interacting with my fellow musicians. And I thought it's really special when the instruments and the singers, like when you have, instead of just one singer, you get to actually interact with another voice, with another person. I think that's, as a performer, I find that special. It's part of the community making, I suppose, which is sort of special as a composer, where, you know, it starts with me and the stuff in my head, and I get to interact with Wyatt in my own head, her voice and my voice. So there's two voices of sorts. And then I get to hand this, you know, send it out into the world, and there's other voices. So there's a community aspect to it, I suppose, as well. In contextualizing this particular poetry, I would have to say that this perhaps might be my favorite moment of Snow Angel for several reasons. You know, from a poetry's perspective, I think that it's both special because the poem references another poet I love a little bit in the first line, Mary Oliver, but it's Wyatt's words and Wyatt's statement that I find really powerful, in that, you know, you do not have to be good. Like, there is not one way to recover, and not everybody recovers. I mean, to be blunt about it, I had somebody close to me who was murdered in cold blood by their domestic partner. Not everyone survives trauma. There's not one way to be a survivor or a victim or a human or a woman. And so you do not have to be whatever you have only, I mean, as long as you're still alive, you're you. And that's beautiful, and it's enough. And so I think, for me, the fact that the singers in this get to come together, they sing blended, they're matching each other, they're often singing a single pitch, kind of, I don't know, the coming together of all the voices in your head to just be you. I think for me, it comes from the poetry and from my experience. And yeah, that's what's happening at this point in Snow Angel, this is the kind of second to last number.
Thank you, Bonnie. Please enjoy In Extremis. You'll hear Brianna Perez, soprano, and He Yu Sun, mezzo soprano.
Neal, do you mind if I jump in for just a minute on this, on that
Please.
clip and this compositional technique of having two singers, sing one character? It really reminded me in some ways of the work of the lawyer and the client, because both together really work as one with the goal of telling the same story, right? Which is the client's story, and making that legible to the law through the judicial process. And, sometimes, more like most times, the only time the client's story gets told is through the lawyer in the first thing that you ever file with the court, which is the complaint. It tells the whole story and the claims and the harms. And so few cases actually go to trial before a jury, which is what the client often wants, is to sit in that witness stand and to say, this is what happened to me. This is the harm. This is what I want for redress. This is what I want to be made whole again. And that hardly ever happens. Like less than 3% of cases go to trial. And so the lawyer and the client really do work as kind of two voices with one story in ways that really parallel what happened in these operas. And like I say, often the telling of the story is really the most important part of the case for the client. Of course, they want the redress, they want to be made whole, but telling the story makes it real, right? It really happened when you tell it. It allows for processing and for closure, for moving on, for the healing and the seeing, right, of the story and the people that were the victims. And so, to close up this thought, it's particularly significant for transgender clients and litigants, because federal judges are appointed for life, and there's many old white guys up there, and not to lump them all into one group who don't know transgender people, but many of them do not know transgender people. And so having the lawyer skillfully tell the story of the transgender client is super important, not just for educating judges about what it means to be a transgender person, but to help them actually see the body, right? Going back to the theme of the exhibit, see the body and the identity, and know that transgender folks need legal recourse and protection as well. And so I just saw a lot of parallels between that relationship and the way that these were staged.
Thank you. So I'm so appreciative to you all for sharing and engaging in this conversation. To all of our participants, please join me in giving some Zoom applause for our speakers. As we begin our Q&A portion, I invite you to put your questions in the chat. I will then call on people to ask their questions, which you can do by unmuting your mic. If you prefer I ask the question for you, just let me know. And if you would like to ask a question anonymously, you can also send it to me as a private chat. So I'd like to begin with a question that was submitted to me anonymously. And this is a question for Bonnie to start. In Song of Myself, I felt that it was able to describe an experience that I have in my own thoughts that I didn't know others experienced. What inspired you to write that section that way?
This has an interesting side story in that I actually experimented with this piece electronically using like a digital audio workstation. And I did it entirely with my own voice. When I did the experiment, I actually have a file where all of those, like the speaking parts are myself, and the instruments are my voice modified, like stretched and turned down. So I'm like, it's all sorts of things. And I had a very interesting experience because when I went to enter the breathing, I've definitely had the experience where you just you're just overwhelmed, almost, panic attack style. Like there's just too much. And when I went to create this electronically I did it with samples. So I basically snipped a section of my breath going, and then another section of my breath going. But when I would go to play that, I'm doing it with my fingers, dum, 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 dum. And I found myself almost hyperventilating, just recreating it electronically. And so I actually, for what was a rather personal experience for me in the electronic world, that's actually where, in this case, this began. And then I wanted to translate that into an experience the ensemble could have. And of course, it's wonderful when the ensemble can, you have all the voices of everybody else in your head. I don't know. For me, it's when I try to do something and I feel like I've put my best effort forward and it just wasn't enough. And like, I can hear all the people yelling at me. They aren't really, but I hear them. And so that's where that kind of came from. Just when something is just, you're just overwhelmed and you can't sort your mind out anymore. And yeah, like breathing becomes hard. It's in some ways, it's the counterbalance to the incredible, like calm transcendence of what happens in extremis piece where, just breathe and everything is. So there are some kind of interesting weights there, I suppose, but maybe I answered your question.
Thank you. Is there anybody else that would like to ask a question? Jacob, go for it.
Yes, hi. So this is an open question, but I'm actually going to direct it first towards my sister, Lily. So As One, it's the most produced contemporary opera in the US since 2016, I think. And it's one of very limited operas to feature a transgender character in general. So what do you hope for in terms of trans representation in the future of opera or in art and music in general? And this can be aside from just stories, but in casting and in just representation.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Jake. So something that I think would help a lot is having, I know that this is difficult because as a trans creator myself, I know that there's a lot that goes into it, but having more trans creators, whether it's for operas or books or any form of art, detailing maybe like their own trans experience, because I think something that people, especially the common public, doesn't necessarily understand is that As One is not a universal trans experience. It is a story about one transgender person's journey to their own self-realization and their own fulfillment. So it's like my story is not going to be the same as someone else's. So, like for casting directors, when they have the chance, if they are telling a story that is featuring a trans person, to hire a trans actor, preferably someone of the matching identity, than, instead of having to do what I call the Eddie Redmayne, Jared Leto effect. It's a very tired casting decision that lots of casting directors, especially in Hollywood still, they'll use cis men or they'll use cis women, which is somewhat less insulting, but still it's trans people, especially trans performers, they are better at telling trans stories than cis people ever will. So I think for any casting directors who are interested in telling trans stories, look into our community for actors, look into our community for inspiration. But I think that will help is just having like more variation of stories to tell. Because as much as I love As One, it isn't perfect. It has a baritone who traditionally is usually played by a male role, and then a mezzo soprano who's traditionally played by a female role. And I think that there's always room for improvement. This is a wonderful opera in and of itself, but it does pose, some very realistic concerns. So it's like, well, not a lot of trans women can sing operatically mezzo soprano range. Most of us can kind of like go for that alto range. And then, for baritone or bass, I'm sure that there are many other, like there are trans women who could play those vocal roles as well. So I just think that, having more variance and variety would, and more people, more like storytelling from trans people ourselves, having more trans creators being featured, I think would help a great deal when it comes to representation.
Go for it, Kyle.
I would just say here to all of that, and to say that we see similar challenges in the law. In the summer of 2020, the US Supreme Court issued a very pro-LGBT case, but during the oral argument of that case, there was 3 cases that were kind of put together. One of them involved a transgender woman and whether she was wrongfully terminated from her position, and the court found she was. But there was a lot of dispute within the LGBT legal community about whether a trans lawyer should argue that case at the US Supreme Court. And I think the answer was hell yes, but that's not what happened. What happened was like cisgender lawyers argued those cases. And so it's the same thing, right? We need trans lawyers standing up in the United States Supreme Court so they see the body and they see the identity and they see the person. And there are great trans litigators who are doing lower court kinds of arguments, and they're doing fantastic work, but the movement needs to uplift those trans lawyers and put them in the front of the podium at the US freaking Supreme Court. And it's the same in the legal academy. I mean, I can count on one hand, on one finger, of trans law professors that I know. And, you know, how do you start legal change if you can't see yourself in the front of the room? Or how do you get advocates who are cisgender advocates who want to advocate for trans rights to know how to be better litigators? You have to have trans professors. So I just agree across the board, in law, in arts, in all of it. We need more representation.
Thank you both. Here. I would like to move on to the next question, but also add that I believe it's important for institutions to hasten the training of trans musicians and to hasten the training of trans singers. And this includes academic institutions, higher education institutions, to examine their systems and their policies and their recruitment and the access, because that's a place where a lot of the training occurs. So we have a question in the chat from Sarah Lynn. How do you feel the works would be altered if performed on the street or in an environment less controlled than a formal concert hall? Open question, fascinating.
Huh. It would definitely be a competitive experience, you know, with the foot traffic and the vehicle traffic. I think it'd be kind of interesting. It'd be a very organic response, though. Any street performance, I think, is wonderful. I love, you know, walking through, you know, a city or even a town, and I'm seeing like a street performer, you know, do their thing. So these operas probably, especially as one, I think those two will probably have a few more mixed reactions in the street, because when it's in the street, that's a very public venue. And so whereas, you know, like with the Lead Center performances that we had on Tuesday, people came who, you know, like, because we were like sharing, you know, these events like for you know, oodles. You know, people attended or people watched, you know, online, who knew that they were able to handle it or in a spot where they would be interested in learning more about these two issues. On the street, you don't really have any of that filtering going on. So I feel like the reaction would be more raw, whether it's for good or for ill. But that's just my take on what it would be like if it was just performed out there.
I might jump in. I mean, I think it's a really interesting idea. And to be honest, I'm really glad you asked that. It's one I hadn't considered, but now I'm kind of thinking, yeah, how could we make that work, sort of thing. I absolutely agree with a number of the things that Lily said. And I mean, you know, of course, ever pragmatic, I'm kind of thinking, well, I mean, you know, how loud are cars and trucks compared to like a string quartet or a really, really beautiful solo viola line? You know, and always when we do outdoor performances, you know, that's certainly always a thing that conductors and musicians think about. However, I mean, the pandemic has really forced us all to rethink and reconsider and adapt. And I could see that selections from both of these works would really lend themselves to some kind of outdoor setting or concert. You know, I guess the thing about, you know, As One particularly being a work of 75 minutes length, I mean, that's quite a while to stand on a street corner and take it all in. So I don't know, in terms of getting the whole story of the opera across, that would necessarily translate. However, I can really see that perhaps a section, for example, like the whole, like Norway, that would, you know, that fits together as a section, and or perhaps, you know, a couple of the numbers from either part 1 or part 2. Thank you, given me something to think about. I clearly need another summer project.
Wonderful. Adina, let me know that Elaine raised her hand for a question.
Oh yes. My question is for Bonnie. As seen the as seen the snow angel in the last piece for the moving still, and do you, I mean, for your purpose for this opera, do you think she already moving from all the things for your purpose? Because for me, I know everyone's interpretation is different, but for my version, I think there's some of these traumas are hidden in the heart and cannot be a cure, and they can only be hidden and forced to move on. But I want to hear from you, like, what do you think of these kind of things?
If I understand your question correctly, it has to do with what's happening at the end of Snow Angel emotionally. And for me, the, I guess, narrative arc, such as it is, really doesn't have anything to do with happily ever after. It has a lot more to do with reclaiming your voice and your agency. So to move beyond something, but you're being, I think the juxtaposition in the text of being still and moving on, and hang on, I gotta make this go away. Sorry, I have to use my cell phone for internet, and so it's on. You just have to ignore that. Okay, so my cell phone's my internet. So the idea of being still but also moving, we carry our stories. It's not that we erase what happened, but that we reclaim ourselves, and we're able to take ourselves forward, or perhaps not take ourselves forward, but in some way that we reclaim some sense of self and something about ourselves that's important, and we reclaim ownership of our lives and agency to the point we're able, which for some people is more or less. And I think however you do that, or to what extent you do that, I think those are all okay. Like, how you do it is what matters. But that's where I'm going with that. It's not happily, to me, it's not happily ever after. Oh, it never happened to me. Oh, I'm fine now. I think it's just continuing to move in your life journey.
Thank you. There's a question that was sent to me in the chat. Could you share a little bit about the projections used in As One? I found them really effective, and think it's relevant to considering artwork. So I'll start with this one. One of the co-librettists for As One, Kimberly Reed, is an acclaimed filmmaker, and I encourage you to check out her work and to spend some time with it. And as she was creating As One, she created this film to go along with the opera, and it is mandatory for all productions. And it really is effective. I totally agree. There are 5 screens and 5 films that are projected at once and tell the story and bask the singers in light and bask the singers in color, and it's really beautiful. It was quite the technical feat. And I must take this opportunity to shout out the people that made it possible. We had David Warner construct the screens for us from the theater department. And he did so rather inexpensively, which we were thankful for, and rather creatively with a new material. And then to Ann House at the Lead Center, who hung these screens and mapped the projections on them and worked with Kimberly Reed exhaustively to get it just right. So major props to those people. Are there any other questions? Dr. Mendez.
Well, before I ask a question, I just want to say, on behalf of my colleagues, behalf of School of Music, on behalf of KU Opera, thank you for the presentation of these two incredible journeys. I mean, you took us on these emotional, musical, philosophical, deep journeys, and I, for one, just to say I enjoyed every minute of it is strange, but I did. And thank you, Neal. Thank you, Dr. Watson. Thank you to all the singers and Bonnie. Thank you very much. My question would be for the performers. You know, we train in a, let's just call it a Western classical bel canto type of singing, and you were asked by these composers to really stretch your technical abilities. Perhaps you can talk about maybe something that you found inside yourself as a singer during your, I keep using the word journey, with these pieces.
Thank you, Dr. Mendez. In consideration of time, we will have this as our last question, but I love this question, and we have several of our performers here with us, and Sarah is up currently on my screen. Sarah, what do you think?
Yeah, I think one of the joys that I find in performing contemporary music is kind of this ability to find freedom and flexibility in vocal, in like making vocal sounds. So yeah, just kind of knowing that we kind of not only were expected to make some maybe less traditional sounds, but encouraged to make less traditional sounds and really, you know, do it in a way that's organic and not, produced, like really, you know, doing things like screams and straight tone and really just like pulling and pushing and really seeing what we can do to bring the music off the page and bring these texts to life, which are so important, and these stories, which are like so moving and universal, and just like, it was really an honor to get to do that. So thank you to everyone who made this happen. It just is definitely the most important project I've ever worked on.
Thank you, Sarah. I see Emlyn has her hand raised.
I just wanted to add on to that. I've never been really good at singing musical theater, but the text is the most important part of both of these productions. And for me, I really had to prioritize the text and make sure that while I'm singing healthily, I am enunciating. And so that my challenge was doing that appropriately. And I definitely, you know, while I've spent my entire education learning legato and the bel canto style, I really had to just kind of just break up with that for this production. But yeah, it not only as a singer helped me learn more about myself, but it was a great educational opportunity for me otherwise. So
thank you, Emlyn. Thank you, Sarah. Jacob, go for it.
I'll make it quick for y'all, but I mean, Y'all, like, this is I'll be super casual about it. This was my first contemporary opera. This was one of my first big roles in an opera ever. I just turned 22. Like, I'm not trying to like sound like super mature, but you know, this is contemporary operas are, a lot of them are hard work, you know, like I didn't know doing that going into it. Like, I was expecting something, it would be a challenge because it's a large piece of music. These are great, wonderful, and very like intrinsic works of music, like pieces of music. But I mean, y'all, like, so it was the biggest growing experience for me, because a lot of how I judge myself as a young artist is based off of the expectations I hold for myself, that the people hold for the expectations held on the music I'm singing. And with doing such a newer piece of work, there's not that many expectations. I mean, there are, but you know, not as much as something written in 1758. So it was the most freeing experience for me. And it really just showed me that, you know, like working with such a new idea in such an old art form, it's absolutely freeing to the audience, to the performers, the musicians, the librettists, you know, and it's absolutely wonderful. And I hope to do it more in the future. I hope more colleges plan to do it more in the future, because the way that the audience received these pieces of work was, and I had some people that have never watched an opera that are friends of mine at the college, in a fraternity even, you know, and they were like, I loved these pieces of work. They were something I never thought I'd see in opera, and I hope to see it more in the future. And it was wonderful. So I thank everyone for this opportunity.
I hope to see more of it too. Let's do it. This concludes our community conversation tonight. Thank you from the bottom of my heart to our panelists. Thank you to the Spencer Museum of Art. And thank you to everyone for being here. Of course, we're considerate of time. If you have to go, please feel free. I'll hang around for a couple minutes, and anybody else is invited to, but wonderful to see you all. Thank you.